We move through life asking, why do they treat me this way? Yet rarely do we ask, what energy do I bring into the room? Our outer world often reflects the image we hold within. If you dare to act differently, consciously, purposefully, you'll witness a strange alchemy. The world around you changes, almost as if reality were waiting for your permission. Today, I will give you 5 ways to act differently, not to manipulate others, but to liberate your authentic self. And when you do, observe how people respond to the light you begin to radiate. In a world intoxicated by its own voice, where the compulsion to speak has become a reflex, there is a rare and quiet power that lies dormant in the depths of silence. The modern psyche is overstimulated, caught in an endless loop of projection, reaction, and defense. It yearns for validation through sound, noise, and proclamation, each word thrown outward like a net, hoping to catch significance in the eyes of others. But few realize that in the very act of constant speaking, we bury the truth, suffocate the soul, and blind the inner eye that sees beyond masks. To speak less and observe more is not to retreat from life. It is to enter it fully, but differently. Most speak from the ego, from a restless place that fears invisibility, but when you choose silence, not as evasion, but as a vessel of presence, you become something else entirely. You become a mirror, and in that mirror, others begin to see themselves. Not the image they construct for the world, but the raw and unguarded self that longs, often in secret, to be seen. There is immense psychological depth in this act. Listening without needing to respond is a radical dismantling of ego. It is a quiet but deliberate surrender of control. The silence we hold becomes a crucible, one in which another person's truths can rise to the surface, unimpeded by the fear of interruption or dismissal. When we cease to impose our will, our opinion, or our rebuttal into the space, we offer a sanctuary, and in this sanctuary the soul feels safe enough to speak. I once worked with a woman who had become invisible in her own workplace. Not because she lacked intelligence or drive, on the contrary, she was perceptive and capable. But her constant striving to contribute, to be heard, to prove herself, had rendered her predictable, easy to overlook. Her words, though well-intentioned, came from a place of insecurity. They were not invitations for dialogue, but declarations of worth, and so she became background noise in the theater of meetings. It took one shift, simple, yet profound. She stopped preparing her answers while others were speaking. She stopped interjecting with solutions before fully hearing the problem. She gave her attention fully to the speaker, not to the performance of listening, but to the presence of it. No nodding for approval, no leaning forward to signal interest, just stillness, just openness. What followed was not magic, but something deeper, an alchemy of human connection. Her colleagues began to confide in her, to pause longer in her presence, to treat her not as a mouth, but as a mind. Her superiors began to ask for her insight, not because she forced her way into the spotlight, but because her silence had gained gravity. She had stopped trying to be seen, and so people began to look. To observe more is to see the symbolic layers beneath behavior. People rarely say what they mean, and even more rarely mean what they say. When you listen with the fullness of your attention, you begin to discern the archetypes moving behind the mask. The man who boasts is often terrified. The woman who interrupts may be yearning for recognition long denied. These patterns emerge, not through words, but through presence. You do not analyze, you feel. You do not judge, you witness. This kind of observation is not passive. It is the most active engagement of the psyche. It requires discipline to restrain the compulsion to speak, to not fill the gap with advice, stories, or cleverness. And in this restraint, you develop a new kind of inner authority, not loud but luminous. People sense it. They may not name it, but they trust it. Because it does not seek to dominate, it simply is. The paradox is clear. When you stop striving to be seen, you become visible, not as a projection, but as a presence. People remember how you made them feel, not because you dazzled them with brilliance, but because you made space for them to exist. To be seen clearly by another without being edited or fixed is an experience so rare it borders on the sacred. And yet this is not merely a social tactic, it is a spiritual posture. When you choose to listen deeply, you train yourself in humility. You relinquish the need to control the narrative. You place yourself in service of something greater, the unfolding of truth in another, and as you listen more, you begin to hear the quiet voice within yourself that is often drowned in noise. Your own soul, neglected in the rush to be relevant, begins to speak in symbols, in intuition, in insight. Observation turns inward. You become aware not just of others, but of your own reactions, projections, and blind spots. This is the path of self-awareness through relationship, not through isolation, but through intentional engagement. You come to realize that every conversation is not a battlefield, but a mirror. Every moment of silence held for another is a moment of transformation for both. And so the practice becomes not a tool to be used, but a way of being. But beware, the ego will resist. It will demand that you speak up, prove your value, reclaim your space. It will scream that silence is weakness. This is its fear, not truth. Real power is not in the performance of strength, but in the quiet assurance of self. To speak less is not to be silent forever. It is to wait until your words are necessary, born from clarity rather than compulsion. And when you do speak, those words carry weight, not because they are loud, but because they come from stillness. In a time where everyone is shouting, to choose silence is to rise above the noise. To observe rather than react is to claim authorship over your own consciousness. And in doing so, you offer others the rarest of gifts. Not answers, not approval, but presence. That is how trust is built. That is how transformation begins. Speak less, observe more, and watch as the world, once deaf to your voice, begins to listen. When we speak of belonging, not merely in the superficial sense of fitting into a group or a room, but in the profound existential sense of recognizing our right to take up space in this life, we tap into a fundamental psychological truth. The way one carries oneself is not merely a matter of social posture or manners, but a direct emanation of the inner self. The psyche declaring, "I am here and I matter." This is no trivial thing. To carry oneself as if one belongs is to act in accordance with one's inner truth, and this alignment between the inner world and outer expression creates a powerful psychological resonance. There is a mysterious law of reflection in the human world. What we radiate, we attract. This is not mere superstition or some pop culture notion of manifestation, but a deeper principle of how the psyche interacts with the collective. Confidence, when it is quiet, rooted in authenticity, not pride, becomes a gravitational force. It draws people not through noise, but through stillness. It does not demand attention, it receives it, because it affirms its own existence without condition. In contrast, the person who doubts their right to belong sends ripples of hesitation into the field around them, and others, unconsciously, often respond in kind. This is the tragic irony of the human condition. So many go through life waiting for the world to affirm their worth before they dare believe in it themselves. But the psyche does not operate by external validation. The inner self does not awaken by permission. It awakens by declaration. Consider the story of Aaron, a man whose external position in society was humble. He mopped floors, he emptied trash bins, but whose soul harbored a longing for something greater. Every break he took in the library, every book he opened, every page he turned, was an act of psychic rebellion against the external verdict life had seemingly handed him. And yet, in truth, Those quiet actions were not rebellion, but reclamation. He was reclaiming his right to belong to the world of ideas, the world of philosophy, a realm he had not been officially invited into. Aaron did not barge through doors demanding recognition. He simply began to live as if he was already home, and the world, in time, caught up to his inner decision. Professors noticed, not because he begged them to, but because something in him began to radiate a conviction they could not ignore. When a man stands fully inside his own being, the world must make room for him. It may not happen immediately, it may not happen easily, but the psyche is not bound by the timetable of the world. It is bound only to truth. This is why the greatest transformation does not begin with an opportunity. It begins with a shift in posture. It begins in the mind, where one decides not to apologize for existing. It begins when the soul stops whispering, "Is it okay if I shine?" and begins to declare, "I am a light, and I will shine whether you notice or not." But the path to that inner declaration is not easy. It is littered with the voices of the past, of teachers who silenced us, parents who projected their fears, peers who made us feel small, systems that told us we were not enough. These voices do not leave easily. They reside in the shadows of the psyche, whispering doubts, urging us to stay hidden, to avoid risk, to wait for permission. And yet, the paradox is that no one can grant you belonging. They can recognize it, but only after you've claimed it for yourself. The act of belonging is not passive. It is an inner act of sovereignty. You crown yourself, not with arrogance, but with the quiet dignity of someone who knows they are part of the human fabric, no more and no less worthy than any other. We must each face the threshold of self-doubt, that inner gatekeeper who asks, "Who are you to belong here?" The answer must rise from deep within, "Who am I not to?" The very fact of your existence is proof that you are part of the whole. The breath in your lungs, the pulse in your veins, these are not earned, they are given. And with them comes the right to show up fully, to speak, to act, to participate in the unfolding of the world. And this is not merely about personal gain. The world needs people who have claimed their place, not to dominate, but to serve, not to seek power over others, but to bring forth the fullness of who they are, because the fullness of a person always offers something to the whole. When you shrink, the world does not become safer or better. It becomes dimmer. One less light shines, one less truth is spoken, one less soul lives freely. Aaron's story is not rare in its potential. It is rare only because so few are willing to take that first daring step, to walk into the library, so to speak, even when the world says, "You don't belong here." He chose to live the identity he knew in his bones was true. And the moment he did, life began to echo his choice. So ask yourself, what would change if you stopped waiting? What would happen if you began to walk into every room with the unshakable sense that you were meant to be there? Not because you are better, not because you have proven something, but because you are. The path to that kind of living is not found in external achievements, but in inner alignment. It is in the way you speak to yourself in the silence, in the way you choose your clothes, not for show, but to honor yourself, in the way you meet your own eyes in the mirror each morning and whisper, "You are enough." And slowly the world begins to mirror back that truth, not because the world has changed, but because you have. The inner world, once shifted, alters the outer. The psyche, once awakened, transforms the landscape around it. Belonging is not a destination. It is not granted by others. It is not something you apply for. It is a birthright. And the greatest tragedy is not being denied that right. It is forgetting it. But once remembered, once reclaimed, it becomes a force so powerful, so radiant, that it opens doors no key could ever unlock. So carry yourself as if you belong, because you do. And in doing so, you become not just a witness to your own transformation, but an invitation to others to remember their own worth. In your quiet confidence, you hold up a mirror to the world that says, you too are welcome here. There is a point in the journey of the self where the soul begins to ache, not from wounds inflicted by others, but from the slow erosion of its own truth. In a world that thrives on validation, we are conditioned, trained even, to explain ourselves endlessly, to justify every instinct, every choice, every flicker of intuition, as if our very existence demands footnotes and citations. We learn early that silence is suspicious, that confidence is arrogance unless tempered by humility, and that every no must come with a long, apologetic prologue. But beneath this social scaffolding lies a deeper truth, one that cannot be negotiated or rationalized. The true self does not seek approval, it seeks alignment. It seeks to live, not be explained. When you find yourself in the habit of over-explaining, of crafting narratives to soothe the discomfort of others, you are not standing in your power. You are crouching beneath it. Each explanation, no matter how articulate, becomes a subtle performance. A gesture not of strength, but of need. A yearning for permission, disguised as transparency. And though we might convince ourselves that we are being kind or communicative, often we are merely asking others to validate what we already know to be true. This is not communication, it is supplication. It is the slow sacrifice of sovereignty at the altar of being understood. But what if you chose another path? One where your actions, imbued with clarity and rooted in conviction, stood as the only explanation necessary. What if you released the compulsion to be agreeable, to be digestible, and instead chose to be whole? Imagine how liberating it would feel to say no without a paragraph attached, to pivot without writing a thesis on why, to grow without needing to convince anyone it was the right time. There is a sacredness to decisions made from the marrow of authenticity. They resonate, they radiate, they do not beg for comprehension because they do not require it. The person who lives from this space becomes magnetic, not because they are trying to be, but because they are whole. We are drawn not to perfection, but to coherence. To the human being who does not flinch when misunderstood, who walks away when peace requires distance, who lets go, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. Consider the story of a woman who changed the very texture of media. Early in her career, she was told that her emotionality was a flaw, that to succeed in the world of television she had to be colder, harder, more palatable. She could have argued, she could have written letters, fought for her voice to be accepted on their terms, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned further into her truth. She made space for emotional honesty on screens where it had been exiled, and in doing so, she didn't just succeed. She transformed the industry. Her name became synonymous with vulnerability, with heart-centered leadership, not because she explained her way into acceptance, but because she embodied a truth so deep it could not be denied. This is the alchemy of purpose. When you are rooted in your own clarity, the world begins to shift around you. Your essence, unfiltered and unapologetic, begins to disturb the status quo. And that is precisely the point. You were not born to be agreeable, you were born to be real. And realness is often disruptive. It makes people uncomfortable. It refuses to shrink. It doesn't perform politeness at the cost of personal integrity. It simply is. We must learn to trust the eloquence of our actions, to know that a boundary, once enacted, speaks volumes. That silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes a roar. That walking away is not an act of aggression, but an act of preservation. And that you owe no one an explanation for the sacred act of honoring your inner compass. This is not to say we should be cold or indifferent, quite the opposite, But there is a profound difference between connection and codependence, between being open and being porous. When we explain ourselves too often, we open the door to be negotiated with. We turn our deepest truths into talking points. But your worth is not a debate. Your purpose is not a bullet point in someone else's understanding, and your value does not increase with comprehension. The human psyche craves resonance. It seeks alignment with what feels authentic and whole. When someone lives their truth without preamble, without apology, it strikes a chord in those around them. It gives unspoken permission for others to do the same. There is something immensely powerful about someone who no longer needs to be seen to know they exist, who no longer needs to be validated to know they matter, who no longer explains, because they have become the embodiment of what they used to articulate. The path of integrity is not easy. It will ask of you to walk away from approval, to become comfortable with being misunderstood, and to develop an unshakable trust in your own inner authority. But in return, it offers you something far more enduring: the quiet power of a life lived from the inside out. A life that doesn't beg to be seen, but simply is, radiant, resolute, undeniable. So, let your life speak. Let your presence articulate what words cannot. Let your boundaries teach others how to treat you. Let your silence remind them that not every truth requires commentary. And let your actions, pure and intentional, become the language of your becoming. There is a strength in stillness, in not rushing to fill every silence with justification. There is wisdom in restraint, in knowing that not all things must be explained for them to be true. And there is dignity in sovereignty, in the quiet assertion that you are enough, precisely as you are, without footnotes, without approval, without applause. Be that. Be undeniable. To stand firmly in one's truth is to risk exile. This is the ancient tension every soul must endure: the yearning to be seen and the terror of being misunderstood. Yet, in the crucible of misunderstanding, the true self is tempered. The individual, if brave, must walk into the fire of others' projections, knowing full well that some will never see them clearly. And that is not only acceptable, it is necessary. When we begin to live from a place of deep authenticity, something remarkable happens. The masks fall away. The well-rehearsed smiles, the clever dodges, the calculated silences, these all lose their utility. Instead, we speak with a voice that trembles not from fear but from truth. We act not for applause, but for alignment. And when we do this, a curious silence often greets us. A silence not of admiration, but of confusion. People who once nodded in approval no longer understand. Friends grow distant, colleagues raise eyebrows. We are no longer the image they expected. We have become a mirror they did not request. And still, we must go on. To be misunderstood is not a punishment, but a rite of passage. It marks the moment when the self steps away from the collective dream and begins to weave a pattern of its own. This is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It is the soul's declaration of independence. And though the world may not welcome this departure with open arms, it is the only way to fully inhabit one's life. Those who fear judgment become prisoners of perception. Their lives shrink to the size of others' expectations. Like shadows on a cave wall, their potential is shaped by flickering images, never fully real. They move not toward growth, but toward acceptance, a false harmony that silences the call of their deeper nature. But the self, the true self, was never meant to live in the cage of approval. It was meant to breathe in wild air, to move toward purpose, even if it meant walking alone. There is profound irony in this. When we chase understanding, we dilute ourselves. We twist, shrink, and polish until we become digestible, palatable. But in doing so, we betray the very essence that makes us unique. And worse, we attract those who resonate not with who we are, but with the mask we've fashioned. What have we gained if we are embraced not for our truth, but for our disguise? The wise, however, stop chasing. They turn inward, not to hide, but to root. They know that being fully oneself is not a call to arrogance, but to courage. To live authentically is to accept that not all will celebrate you. Some will resist, others will ridicule, many will project their own wounds upon you. And you, if you are brave, will not retaliate. You will not contort yourself for the comfort of others. You will let them misunderstand, not out of indifference, but out of love. For you know their perception is not your responsibility. You are not their mirror. Real strength lies not in being universally adored, but in being unwaveringly yourself, even in the face of opposition. A Harvard Business Review study once observed that leaders who took principled stands, even unpopular ones, were rated as more trustworthy and respected over time than those who sought to appease. Why? Because clarity commands respect. Even when people disagree, they are drawn to those who live with conviction. There is something magnetic about a person who is not trying to be liked, but is simply trying to be true. This principle transcends leadership. It applies to artists, teachers, parents, lovers, anyone who dares to live fully. When you speak from the heart, your voice may crack, but it will echo. When you choose your path, not for popularity but for purpose, your steps will be steadier. And when you allow others to misunderstand you without crumbling or defending, you give them the space to meet their own shadows. In this way, your authenticity becomes a lighthouse, not a beacon of perfection, but a testament to what is possible when a soul refuses to shrink. Yet, it is not easy. The temptation to explain, to justify, to win back those who doubt you, it can be overwhelming. But explanations are often the currency of the insecure. The soul needs no defense. When you are misunderstood, breathe deeply. Return to the truth you know in your bones. Let your actions, over time, reveal your heart. The people meant to walk with you will feel your frequency. They will not need footnotes to understand your presence. And those who still can't see you clearly, bless them. And move on. To stop chasing universal approval is to reclaim your life. It is to step off the stage and into your soul. It is to recognize that being liked by everyone is a sign you've likely abandoned yourself. Approval is addictive, yes, but authenticity is liberating. The applause may fade, but the freedom remains. In this world, we are trained to fit in, to be agreeable, to color within the lines. But the soul was born to scribble, to stretch, to rupture boundaries, and so make peace with being misunderstood. Wear it not as a wound, but as a badge. It means you are growing beyond the reach of shallow praise. It means your life is beginning to echo the contours of your essence. And so, walk on. Speak truth. Live full. Be misunderstood. Gloriously, wildly, unashamedly misunderstood, because in that misunderstanding, your soul is finally being heard. Imagine for a moment the person you are destined to become, not as a fantasy or vague aspiration, but as an inevitable unfolding, the result of 1,000 choices made in the shadows of your ordinary days. That future self, wise, luminous, collected not by the absence of hardship, but by the alchemical transformation of it, holds the key to a new way of being, not just for yourself, but for the world around you. What if you were to treat every person, every interaction, as though you were speaking not from the fragile self of the moment, but from that integrated, radiant future self? How would your energy shift? How would your presence command something different? Not from demand, but from depth. To live from this space is not to pretend. It is not performance. It is the opposite. It is embodiment. When we treat others not based on the conditions they present us with, coldness, irritation, distraction, but based on the boundless maturity of who we are becoming, we step out of the reactive loop that keeps us chained to an identity we've long outgrown. The essence of transformation lies not in rearranging outer circumstances, but in reorienting the internal compass, and that compass must be set toward wholeness. There is something quietly revolutionary about responding with grace when hostility is expected. There is something profoundly powerful about extending patience, not because it is deserved in the moment, but because you have become someone for whom patience is the natural overflow. This is not passivity. This is not submission. It is strength. Unyielding, centered strength that comes not from needing to win the moment, but from holding a longer vision of becoming. We are mirrors to one another. When you meet someone with the frequency of your future self, you create a rupture in the ordinary. People sense it, often without understanding it. They adjust to it. The field between you shifts. You stop battling for dignity and start radiating it. It becomes less about what others owe you and more about what you already carry within. I remember a woman, worn down by years of betrayal and disappointment, who began writing letters to her future self. Not as a journal exercise, but as a lifeline. Each letter spoke of who she was becoming, fierce and tender, clear-eyed and open-hearted. She read those letters daily, and slowly she began to act from their voice, not from the voice of her wounded history. She walked away from relationships that diminished her, not in anger, but in clarity. She no longer begged for validation because her future self had already given it. She surrounded herself with people who resonated with her new frequency, not because she demanded it, but because she had become it. The world around her did not change first. She did. And the world responded in kind. This is the truth so many resist because it demands responsibility and relinquishment. You don't attract what you want. You attract what you are. This is not meant to shame, it is meant to empower. Because what you are is not fixed. It is a river, constantly shaped by choice, awareness, and will. You cannot control others, but you can decide what version of yourself walks into the room. You can decide what energy speaks, even when your mouth is silent. Every moment becomes a threshold. Will I act from my history or from my destiny? Will I speak as the one who has been hurt or the one who has healed? Will I lead with suspicion or with the wisdom that knows the cost of cynicism? When you treat others as you would treat your future self, you are not performing sainthood. You are saying, "This is who I have decided to become, and nothing in your behavior will cause me to betray that decision." There is no power greater than inner congruence, the alignment between who you say you want to be and how you show up when no one applauds you for it. This is where real transformation happens, not in the grand gestures, but in the thousand silent, intentional acts of treating people with the dignity you would want extended to the most whole version of yourself, even when they don't deserve it. Especially when they don't deserve it. So? All right, because you are not acting from a transactional place. You are building a world. This path is not easy. It requires vigilance. It requires surrendering the small self who wants vindication, recognition, and retaliation. It requires remembering that the most powerful version of you is not the one who finally proves their worth, but the one who no longer needs to. And from that space, grace is no longer weakness, it is sovereignty. You will begin to see it, the subtle shift in people's eyes when they feel seen, not as who they are in their messiness, but as who they might become if someone dared to believe in their wholeness. You become a living mirror to their potential, not through words, but through being. And this, above all, is what changes the world. So do not wait for the future self to arrive. Summon them now. Ask them how they would walk, how they would listen, how they would forgive. Act accordingly, and watch as the landscape of your life rearranges to meet you, not because you pushed, but because you aligned. Sue, act like this. Watch how people treat you differently. Not because you're playing a role, but because you've removed the mask. You've allowed your true self to emerge. And when that happens, the world, like a mirror catching sunlight, reflects you with new light. Remember these 5 truths. 1. Speak less, observe more. 2. Carry yourself as if you belong. 3. Let your actions speak. 4. Be okay with being misunderstood. 5. Treat others how your future self would. This is not a script for manipulation. It is a call to return home to yourself. Because once you act like you know who you are, the world will finally begin to recognize it too.